What if I told you that the most powerful person in the world right now might be the least prepared for the responsibility? That democracy itself hangs by a thread not because of external enemies, but because of the very system designed to protect it. We're talking about Donald Trump's return to the presidency in 2025, and whether his leadership represents an existential threat to global stability. This isn't about partisan politics. This is about patterns, psychology, and the dangerous intersection of personality disorders with ultimate power. If you value content that challenges you to think beyond the obvious, subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're going on a journey together that requires intellectual courage, because what we're about to explore will make you question everything you think you know about leadership, power, and the fragility of democratic institutions. The question isn't whether you like or dislike Trump. The question is, can a democracy survive when its leader exhibits traits that psychologists associate with authoritarian personalities? And more importantly, what does that mean for the rest of the world? Let me start with something that might shock you. In 1932, Adolf Hitler received only 36.8% of the popular vote in Germany's presidential election. He lost. Yet within a year, he was chancellor, and within 2 years, he had consolidated absolute power. How? Through the very democratic institutions that were supposed to stop him. Here's what's terrifying. It wasn't a coup. It was legal. Now, before you think I'm making a direct comparison, stay with me. I'm not saying Trump is Hitler. I'm saying democracies are more fragile than we think, and the patterns of how they collapse are eerily consistent. Consider this. In Venezuela, Hugo Chavez was democratically elected in 1998 with massive popular support. He promised to fight corruption and give power back to the people. 25 years later, Venezuela is a dictatorship where people eat garbage to survive. Chavez and his successor Maduro didn't destroy democracy overnight. They used democratic tools to dismantle democracy piece by piece. Or look at Turkey's Recep Erdogan. Elected as a reformist in 2003, he gradually transformed Turkey from a secular democracy into an Islamic authoritarian state. Today, Turkey imprisons more journalists than any other country in the world. What do these leaders have in common? They all exploited the same psychological vulnerability in democratic societies. People's willingness to trade freedom for the promise of simple solutions to complex problems. And here's the pattern that should terrify you. They all started by attacking the press, the judiciary, and the concept of objective truth itself. To understand what we're dealing with, we need to talk about Hannah Arendt, one of the most important political philosophers of the 20th century. Born in Germany in 1906, Arendt lived through the collapse of the Weimar Republic and witnessed firsthand how Hitler rose to power. After fleeing Nazi Germany, she spent decades studying the nature of totalitarianism. Her masterwork, The Origins of Totalitarianism, published in 1951, reads like a prophetic warning for our times. Arendt identified something crucial. Totalitarian movements don't succeed because people are inherently evil. They succeed because people become disconnected from reality, isolated from each other, and desperate for meaning in an increasingly complex world. She coined a term that's become chilling relevant: the ideal condition for mob rule. This happens when people lose faith in institutions, when they stop believing in the possibility of truth itself, and when they become willing to accept any story that makes them feel special, chosen, or victimized. Arendt observed that totalitarian leaders don't need to be believed. They just need to destroy people's capacity to distinguish between truth and lies. Once that happens, she wrote, people will believe everything and nothing, think that everything was possible, that nothing was true. Does that sound familiar? Arendt also identified what she called the banality of evil, the idea that the greatest atrocities aren't committed by monsters, but by ordinary people who simply stop thinking critically about their actions. She was describing Adolf Eichmann, but she might as well have been describing the psychology of our current political moment. The question Arendt would ask us today is this: are we living through the conditions she identified as perfect for the rise of totalitarianism? And if so, what are we going to do about it? Let's dive deeper into the psychology of what we're dealing with. Modern neuroscience and psychology have identified specific traits that make certain individuals dangerous when given power. The dark triad, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, represents a toxic combination of personality traits that, when concentrated in a single person with authority, can destabilize entire societies. Narcissistic leaders exhibit grandiose self-perception, lack empathy, and require constant admiration. They see criticism as a personal attack and surround themselves with enablers who feed their ego, rather than provide honest counsel. Machiavellian leaders are manipulative, cynical, and willing to use any means to achieve their ends. They see other people as tools to be used rather than human beings deserving respect. Psychopathic traits include impulsivity, lack of remorse, and inability to form genuine emotional connections. They're often charismatic and skilled at mimicking emotions they don't actually feel. Here's what makes this particularly dangerous in the context of Trump's presidency. Research shows that when people with these traits achieve power, they don't become more responsible, they become more extreme. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that individuals with narcissistic traits, when given authority, became increasingly aggressive toward perceived threats and increasingly reckless in their decision-making. But here's the truly scary part. These traits aren't just dangerous for the leader, they're contagious. Social psychology research shows that authoritarian leadership styles normalize aggression, reduce empathy in followers, and create what researchers call moral disengagement. This explains why Trump's influence extends far beyond his direct actions. He's changed the acceptable boundaries of political discourse, normalized lying, and made cruelty seem like strength. The question isn't just what Trump might do with power, it's what he's already done to the American psyche, and by extension, to global political culture. If what we've covered so far has made you think differently about the nature of political leadership and its psychological dimensions, show your appreciation with a like. And if you know someone who isn't afraid to confront uncomfortable truths about our current moment, share this with them. Because what we're about to explore next gets even more unsettling. How these individual psychological patterns scale up to threaten global stability. Let's talk about what happens when the psychology we just explored meets geopolitical reality. Donald Trump's first presidency gave us a preview, alienating traditional allies, praising dictators, withdrawing from international agreements, and treating global diplomacy like a reality TV show. But that was when there were still guardrails, when career diplomats and experienced advisors could sometimes contain the damage. Now, with his return to office in 2025, those guardrails are gone. Trump has explicitly promised to purge the federal government of anyone he perceives as disloyal. He's surrounded himself with enablers rather than experts, and he's facing a world that's more dangerous and unstable than it was during his first term. Consider the current global landscape, an ongoing war in Ukraine that could escalate into direct NATO-Russia conflict, rising tensions with China over Taiwan, climate change creating mass migration and resource conflicts, and democratic institutions under attack worldwide. In this context, Trump's unpredictability isn't just politically problematic, it's existentially dangerous. Remember, this is a man who, according to his former Defense Secretary James Mattis, has no moral compass, who, according to his former Chief of Staff John Kelly, meets the definition of a fascist, who, according to his former National Security Advisor John Bolton, is unfit for office. These aren't partisan opponents speaking, these are the people who worked closest with him and saw firsthand how he operates. Now imagine that same decision-making process applied to nuclear weapons, international trade wars, or military conflicts. Trump has already demonstrated willingness to abandon allies like the Kurds in Syria, to pressure foreign leaders for personal political gain. The Ukraine call that led to his first impeachment, and to believe conspiracy theories over intelligence briefings. But here's what keeps foreign policy experts awake at night: the broader pattern of democratic backsliding globally. Viktor Orban in Hungary, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Narendra Modi in India, and now Trump again in America. These leaders don't operate in isolation. They learn from each other, support each other, and collectively represent a global movement away from liberal democracy toward authoritarianism. The risk isn't just what Trump might do to America. It's how his example emboldens autocrats worldwide and undermines the entire post-World War II international order. So what can we do as individuals in the face of this systemic threat? First, we need to rebuild our relationship with truth. This means developing what philosophers call epistemic humility, the recognition that we might be wrong, that our sources of information might be biased, and that complex problems rarely have simple solutions. Start by diversifying your information sources. Read news from different political perspectives. Seek out primary sources rather than relying on interpretations. When you encounter information that confirms what you already believe, be especially skeptical. Practice what psychologists call cognitive debiasing. Before sharing something on social media, ask yourself, how do I know this is true? What would convince me I'm wrong? Am I sharing this because it's important, or because it makes me feel good second? We need to strengthen our democratic muscles at the local level. Democracy isn't just about presidential elections, it's about school board meetings, city council sessions, and community organizations. Get involved. Show up. The health of democracy depends on citizen participation. Third, we need to build bridges across political divides. Research shows that personal relationships are the most effective antidote to polarization. You don't have to agree with someone on everything to recognize their humanity and find common ground on specific issues. Fourth, support independent journalism and fact-checking organizations. Authoritarian movements always target the press first because free flow of information threatens their control. Subscribe to newspapers, donate to nonprofit news organizations, and share fact-based reporting. Finally, study history. Read about how previous democratic societies responded to authoritarian threats. Learn from both their successes and their failures. Hannah Arendt, whom we discussed earlier, believed that understanding the past was our best defense against repeating its worst mistakes. But individual action, while necessary, isn't sufficient. We also need systemic change. The uncomfortable truth is that individual responsibility and collective action must work together. We can't therapy our way out of a structural problem. At the institutional level, we need serious democratic reforms. The American system, in particular, has vulnerabilities that Trump has exploited and will continue to exploit. The Electoral College, that allows presidents to win without winning the most votes. Gerrymandering that creates safe districts and reduces political accountability. Unlimited money in politics that gives disproportionate influence to wealthy donors. And a Senate structure that gives vastly more power to rural states than urban ones. But beyond electoral mechanics, we need to address the underlying conditions that make populations vulnerable to authoritarian appeals: economic inequality, social isolation, and educational deficits. Research consistently shows that societies with greater economic equality are more resistant to authoritarian movements. When people feel economically secure, they're less likely to scapegoat minorities or support radical political changes. We also need to rebuild social capital, the networks of relationships and trust that hold communities together. Social media has connected us globally while isolating us locally. We need institutions that bring people together across class and political lines: community centers, public libraries, local sports leagues, volunteer organizations. Education reform is crucial. 2. We need to teach critical thinking, media literacy, and civic engagement from an early age. Students should learn how to evaluate sources, understand statistics, recognize logical fallacies, and engage constructively with people who disagree with them. Internationally, democratic countries need to coordinate their response to global authoritarianism. This means strengthening NATO, supporting democratic movements worldwide, and creating economic incentives for countries to maintain democratic norms. We also need new international institutions designed for 21st century challenges: global climate governance, international regulation of social media platforms, and coordinated responses to disinformation campaigns. The paradox is that these solutions require the kind of long-term thinking and international cooperation that authoritarians are specifically designed to undermine. They thrive on chaos, short-term thinking, and zero-sum competition. But history shows us that democratic societies, when they choose to, can rise to meet existential challenges. We return to Hannah Arendt one final time, because she understood something that we're only now learning to appreciate: the fragility of the world we've built. Arendt wrote that power corresponds to the human ability not just to act, but to act in concert. Democracy isn't a system that runs automatically. It's a collective choice that each generation must make anew. She also wrote something that should haunt us. The sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil. That's where we are now. The question isn't whether Donald Trump is uniquely evil. It's whether we're collectively choosing to remain passive in the face of a clear and present danger to democratic civilization. Because make no mistake, this moment will be studied by future historians. They'll ask how we responded when the warning signs were clear, when experts were unanimous in their concern, when the precedents from history were so obvious. They'll want to know whether we chose engagement or apathy, whether we chose truth or comfortable lies, whether we chose the hard work of democracy or the easy surrender to authoritarianism. The terrifying thing about living through historical moments is that you don't know you're living through them until it's too late. But we have the advantage of perspective. We can see the patterns. We understand the psychology. We know how the story is played out before in other times and places. The question is, what are we going to do with that knowledge? Hannah Arendt believed that every generation faces what she called the burden of responsibility, the choice between actively participating in the world or passively allowing others to shape it for us. She wrote, "Power can be actualized only where word and deed have not parted company, where words are not empty and deeds not brutal, where words are not used to veil intentions but to disclose realities, and deeds are not used to violate and destroy but to establish relations and create new realities." That's the choice before US, not just as Americans, but as global citizens watching the world's most powerful democracy wrestle with its own potential destruction. So here's my final question for you. What idea are you willing to question this week? Maybe it's the assumption that it can't happen here. Maybe it's the belief that individual actions don't matter. Maybe it's the comfort of thinking that someone else will solve these problems for us. Whatever it is, leave it in the comments below. Tell us what this conversation has challenged you to reconsider. And if this video has awakened something in you, a sense of urgency, a recognition of responsibility, or simply a deeper understanding of the stakes we're facing, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, because this is how we resist, together, thinking, questioning, and refusing to let democracy die from our indifference. The future isn't predetermined. It's still ours to write, but only if we choose to pick up the pen.